Around 5 years ago, I bought a whole bunch of woodworking tools from my grandfather-in-law's estate, and he had a workbench in his basement, which was not this one, but it wouldn't fit out the door. And by the time we took it apart, I realized that there wasn't anything really worth saving about it besides the vices and some of the hardware. So I knew I needed a workbench, so I ended up making this one. It's based on plans from Stumpy Nubs, his 2x6 Roubo workbench. I say based on because this is made out of hardwood. He suggests just regular 2x6s from the building supply store, but since I have a band sawmill or access to one, we have a whole bunch of hardwood, so this is all, you know, was full 2-inch hardwood, which has been planed down to make the top. So I like the way this bench goes together as far as how it's constructed, because it saves you from actually having to chop mortises because everything is supposed to fit in. I did make a few mistakes in making this piece here. I measured to the wrong point. The short point instead of the long point would set this leg over to the side. Yeah, one other thing I changed from the plans, besides the materials, these little bench dogs, they had in the plans, you put in some little piece of wire or something to stop them. But I found that if you just turn them around and drop them back in again, that's less than 3/4 of an inch, that's like 1/2 inch, and that works perfectly fine for most stuff. And if it doesn't work okay, well, then you can get creative about how you want to hold them up. So that works really well. I also have a few of these that go in the holes. And the holes work for either those or the holdfasts. So the way this is constructed, I first made this center section in between the two legs, and that was sort of my core base, and then the other stuff was sort of laminated on afterwards. So had these pre-drilled these holes before this piece got glued onto there, and then as you're gluing it all together, you can leave spaces and laminate the legs at the same time as you laminate the top, and it saves you from having to chop mortises. So I really like that aspect of the design, because chopping a 2-inch deep precise mortise in hardwood does seem like a large task for somebody who's fairly new at woodworking. The other thing is this strip here for all of my bench dog holes, this was all done and screwed on to here as I went. So I did part of the leg first, then screwed all these on, cut all these notches, all these blocks, all the way along down, all these blocks. I cut them all out beforehand. So since they were all cut, and with that little shoulder to catch this piece beforehand, I didn't have to do any chopping or mortising or anything after the bench was constructed. It was all done beforehand, where it was a lot easier. One other thing that wasn't in the plans that I added was this lower shelf, and it works pretty well for a way to keep all the, to collect all the dust that falls down through, and also keep hand planes and hand saws stuffed underneath there. Probably not the best solution, but it works. I just notched that in. So it's a little bit rough. One thing that I should have done differently is, one thing that's different from the plans is the plans had just the top of this leg be beveled so it fits in better and looks more like a dovetail mortise thing. But they suggested cutting that on a bandsaw, down to there and making your shoulders. But my bandsaw tips only one way, and so does my table saw. So to bevel both sides in opposite directions was not going to be all that easy, and so I decided that while it doesn't look quite as cool, I figured I'd just bevel this leg all the way down, and it works just fine. This outer skirt is a little bit thicker than the center of the top, and I had planned on or thought about doing dog holes along the side, but I never got around to it. One other thing I made a mistake on was how I installed these feet. They work really well. These are great. These are the way to go. However, I've got an uneven floor, and I didn't give myself enough lift. So it'll lift up and roll around, but it'll catch on the floor. Because you think your concrete floor is flat until you actually put something flat along it. I also installed a power strip here so I can plug in my workbench and just have a tool right nearby. That works fairly well. Got my rack here for my bench dogs. My rough end, you can see the outer piece is wider than the inner pieces. This one's curved a little bit. And then this one's skinnier where the bench dog, where the holdfast holes are, because if you have it too thick, they don't grab right. I went with a cast iron vise on the side because, well, I had one. Like I said, I bought up my grandfather-in-law's tools, and he had this vise on his workbench. So I had that as a package deal, so I wasn't going to buy a different vise. I do like the look of a leg vise, but yeah, I'm not gonna change it for that. I do like the vise being mounted flush to the workbench. So to mount this vise flush to the workbench, I notched out this section. This section of cherry is actually only maybe a 1/4 inch thick or 3/8. It's really pretty thin because the other inner jaw is right buried underneath there. So it lowers my vise capacity a little bit, but it's way wider than what I need anyways. But having it flush along the side is great because if I want to hold something really wide, I can put a bar clamp down on this end and hold something. At the end of the bench, I have this vise here which goes all the way across. I have somewhat mixed feelings about this vise. I got a cheap one, so it tends to rack more than what I would like. But having something on the end is great. I like having it go all the way across because it's just a different place to clamp. And also I can clamp a board here vertically and saw down. Whereas my other vise is not very close to the end of the bench, so that gets hard. And then I've got these holes that line up with my bench dog holes, as well as the holdfast holes along the top, which also take these. One other mistake I made was I can't use these holes with the holdfast that are by the vise. It interferes with the vise rails. I tried to be really careful with positioning this vise so that the holdfast would slide down between the rails, but I somehow messed that up, so these like just perfectly hit. So those only work for putting in the little pegs, the little dogs. Also, originally I had shorter holdfasts, and I made myself some longer ones, and I realized that in some ways they're worse because you can see that coming down through here, but if I had, say, my plane here, it would hit against that. So I have to be really careful when I put in the longer holdfasts. So I'll probably cut one of these shorter because I don't really need to hold something that's, you know, 8 inches thick on top of my workbench. And if I do, I can use some other method. On this bottom shelf, I have stuff that I'm likely to use on the workbench itself. So I've got my sander, biscuit joiner, power planer, Back here I've got my pocket screw jig, my Craig jig, bench cookies. Not very tasty bench cookies, but they'll last a long time. As far as a finish goes, for the first several years I just had it bare wood, and that actually worked really well. Things didn't gripped well to it, and it was a good work surface. But I spilled boiled linseed oil on it. I had a cup and I spilled it on it, so I decided I would use boiled linseed oil over the whole surface, and it still works fine. It is a little bit more slippery. One problem I had was with the cheap holdfasts that I had originally, they wouldn't hold in the hardwood holes after I got boiled linseed oil down in them. So these two, they're much rougher, and now they grab on. Oh, let's see, what am I hitting down there? You know, they clamp right into the holes. So be careful when you finish your workbench top, because you could make a nice workbench and then have unusable holes. As far as dimensions go, so the workbench is what, 21¼ wide by 61½ long, and as far as the width goes, that's just sort of what it came out to as far as after I got all my lumber planed up. And the height off the floor is around 34½ inches. I chose that height because that's the height of my table saw. So this can be used as an outfeed table for my table saw. It doesn't work all that well for that because it's just so heavy to maneuver around to the other side of my table saw. But it does work for that. And then I also don't want it higher than my table saw, because if I want to rip a long piece, it has to run along this bench and then onto the saw. I've seen some people make woodworking benches, watch videos of them making them, and while they're pretty, they really seem like they're just a heavy-duty flat surface. Like they don't have any provisions for bench dogs or holes in the top, and they just have a vise and a big flat surface. And while I'm sure that's useful, having multiple ways of clamping something to this surface is fantastic. I can pinch stuff from the ends, I can clamp things on the side, I can do all sorts of different things, and this just makes such a solid, heavy-duty work surface to work on. So your workbench is more than just a flat surface, and this one, let's see, let me show you my other workbenches. Next to my woodworking bench along the wall, I've got just a built-in workbench, and this workbench really kind of tends to just collect crap. I use it as a workbench for more dirty stuff. The bench behind it is great for holding tools. I can just put tools on this bench while I'm working on my woodworking bench. This really should probably get redone into some other system at some point, but yeah, it's one damn project after another. So as far as things I might be missing on this bench, I don't have a sliding dead man. That's a common thing that people put on these benches. But this bench is short. It's just a little bit over 5 feet long, so that doesn't seem like it's that useful on a really short bench because it's short. Also, a tool tray, while my shop is so small that I don't think having a tray out here would be useful, and having one in the middle, it would have to be pretty narrow or make the whole workbench narrow. So I think this works really well for my shop, having a flat surface, the other bench behind it that I can set my tools on, a good solid work surface to work on. So this was one of my very first woodworking projects that I did with the batch of tools that I bought. I knew that every other woodworking project would be easier if I had a good solid workbench. So I made this as one of my first projects, and it really wasn't hard to do. So, and it has made everything else I've made just go so much easier. So don't hesitate to make yourself one of these workbenches. You don't have to follow Stumpy Nubs' plans. They just seem like a good construction method. There's all sorts of other plans and options and designs. There's a interesting one from Woodwork, I forget, I can put them down in the description, of a bench that disassembles, and that could be really useful for some people. Like my brother wants to make a woodworking bench, and he wants to put it down in his basement, but he might be building a garage soon, so it would go in the garage after it's out of the basement. And the idea of hauling this bench up and down into a basement, then back up out again, doesn't sound like a fun time to me. This thing is heavy. On the internet, don't wait. I said every other woodworking project you do will be easier if you have a woodworking bench like this, particularly hand tools. Hand plane without a workbench is, I'm not going to say useless, but it's certainly not nearly as useful. Your piece slides around and moves and never shakes. You clamp something to this and it doesn't go anywhere. And also using power tools with this bench, it makes things easier. I've held down a piece with a holdfast and used my router around the edges, and it just works phenomenal for holding pieces to this bench. I was watching another video where a guy talked about the difference between making a hardwood bench and a softwood bench. He made two benches which were pretty much identical, but one was made out of some sort of hardwood and one was some sort of softwood. And he said for some things he actually liked the softwood bench better, because this bench can be really hard and kind of bouncy. Like when you put something on it and you hit it, there's a lot of sort of shock and vibration. It doesn't grip quite as well. Particularly after I did the linseed oil finish, it's a little bit slippery. But the softwood benches, the pieces kind of, like you're clamping down, kind of squish in a little bit to the top, and it holds really well. Of course, it doesn't last as long, but it holds well. So what are you looking for? So like I said, this bench has some rough edges and some mistakes I made along the way and whatever else. It's not a perfect showpiece, but it is a phenomenal tool. And if something happened to this bench, I would certainly make myself another one. I might use slightly different hardware as far as vices, but the basic design would be the same. I like the flat sides. I like the holes down the middle for the holdfast. These dogs are great. Everything about this bench is really great. I might add in like a little planing stop. I've seen those where they got little metal teeth. That might be useful to have. But overall, there's not much that would need changing about this workbench. I hope you liked this video. If you did, subscribe to my channel. I'll put links down in the description to some of the other workbench plans and builds that I find informative